about our unit and what we did. I often look at pictures like this and whatever happened to these kids? You know, they would be in their 60s now, 60s and early 70s. What you can't see there easily is that the little guy there on the far right is holding a hacksaw. So they're out probably scrapping, trying to get scrap metal. So we work really closely with the Air Force. How many Air Force are in here? How many Air Force? Okay, you guys did a great job. We had the facts. And in fact, these guys formed the unit with us at Fort Knox. And they went over on the boat with us, and they spent their tour with us. And of course, their job, the forward air controllers, was very much like the scout pilots, except they do it higher. They would adjust artillery. They would find targets for us. This is his name's. I remember his name is Brad Page, walking out to his 01 here. Those rockets were smoke rockets for marking the target. You know, the Wings Over the Rockies Museum at Centennial Airport has one of these there. It's an Army version. It's actually in flyable condition. They actually fly it. It's been reconditioned. Beautiful machine. That was my house in Zion when we got back to Zion. Doing the 1-to-1. Okay, let me explain. So I'm coming back from a mission, and I put the pitch down on the helicopter. Now, the helicopter has two controls. You have the cyclic, which gives you, directional control, and the collective, which is up and down pretty much. That's very simplistic, but that's what it amounts to. So I start to put the pitch down, and I start to get this vibration, pretty significant. And I pull the pitch back up, and it goes away. I've been a pilot long enough to know. It's like when you go to the doctor, and he says, it hurts when I do this. What does he say? Don't do that. Yeah. So if you put the pitch down and it's doing this, what should you do? Put it where it doesn't do that. But I still needed to get down. So I finally found a spot just enough, got just a very slight decrease, very shallow descent. So I did kind of a fixed wing approach to the airport, way out, and just, did a run on landing. And as the rotor is spinning down, the co-pilot and I are looking up at the rotor head thinking, well, there must be something wrong up here. But the crew chief, or the gunner, I forget which, was out farther in the rotor blade, and we hear, Jesus Christ, look at this. The rotor blade had split about 3 feet from the tip. And this picture doesn't show, the angle wasn't quite right, but it was actually, you can see daylight up into here. The outboard 3 feet of that blade was just kind of flapping out there. So the maintenance officer got a hold of me a couple of days later. He said, you have no idea how lucky you are. He said, a couple of days before your incident, there's another one where that started, and that piece of the blade actually separated from the helicopter. And of course, the helicopter comes apart in the air, and it takes about a tenth of a second for the imbalance to just tear the transmission out of the helicopter. And obviously that crew died. They traced it to a batch of blades from Bell that had the same manufacturing defect in it. So they were able to trace down these blades by serial number and get them out of service. But it was a manufacturing error with the rotor blades. Okay, so I realized years later that I always wanted to be a portrait photographer, because I took a lot of pictures of my teammates. This is Billy Hiltner here. I'm going to tell you about Billy and Joe. So Billy is playing his music kind of loud. This is, by the way, this is after I was home, and a fellow that extended a while called me up. He said, did you hear about Billy and Joe? I said, no. And he tells me this story. Billy is playing his music kind of loud. Joe comes into his hooch and says, turn the music down. Billy didn't turn the music down. Joe comes back and says, it's too loud, I can't sleep, turn the music down. Billy doesn't turn the music down. Joe goes back, picks up his .38, comes back, and he shoots Billy. The round hit his St. Christopher's medal, which you see hanging around his right here, and it didn't kill him. I never did find out what happened to these two guys, but the fellow that was the platoon leader of the weapons platoon when this happened wrote a book called Maverick. His name was Marvixen, so you know that his call sign was Maverick. And he talks about this episode. He changed their names, but he did talk about not turning the music down and Joe coming in and actually shooting him. So he should have turned his music down. So this is just a bunch of faces here, young guys. Look at all these young guys here. Oh, this guy, I'm in the Parker Library wearing this hat. And he comes over, he said, did you fly Hueys? I said, yeah, I did. He said, when were you in Vietnam? I said, 67, 68. He said, me too. He said, what unit were you in? I said, 3rd of the 17th Cav. Yeah, me too. Turns out, that's him. And we met in the Parker Library about 2 years ago. Yeah, small world sometimes. Just a bunch of young kids, weren't we? Look at that. There's me. Yeah. A couple of days before I left, the gun platoon came to me and said, hey, we'd like a picture of all of us with the Cobra. Can you take a picture? So I did. I took this one and this one. And when I got back to the States, I made enlargements and sent 8x10s out to all the guys back in Vietnam. So know your enemy, Patton Rommel and Mao Zedong. When I was an ROTC student, and I knew I would be going to Vietnam. And there's a book written by Mao Zedong. It's called On Protracted War. And Mao Zedong spelled out exactly how guerrilla warfare works. And to boil it down to a couple of phrases, what it amounts to is you fight when it's to your advantage. You don't get caught. Don't let the enemy catch you. You fight when you want to fight. If it gets tough, you just withdraw. And if it gets really tough, just withdraw altogether. Go back into the populace. The enemy will go home, and you can come back. And that's the general what it said. So while I'm in Vietnam, I mentioned this to my CO, to Major Luck. He said, you shouldn't read that stuff. I thought you're supposed to know your enemy. If McNamara and Johnson and others had read that, maybe they would have taken a different tack to this whole thing. You can still buy that book. I looked for my copy. I can't find it, but it wasn't worth spending $40 for a new copy. So here's really a very simple timeline for what got us into that. During World War II, FDR, after World War II, he did not really approve of France having colonies. He didn't like the colonization. He was just fine with Vietnam becoming a free country, not under the French thumb. But unfortunately, he didn't tell Truman, and of course, FDR died. So Truman, he supported the French in Indochina. After all, they were our allies in World War II. At this time, Ho Chi Minh was actually trying to tell us, to help us get the French out of here. But we didn't listen. Whoops. So Eisenhower supported the whole French anti-guerrilla effort with money, sent them equipment. And of course, the French got out of there with their big defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. We didn't learn anything. Bay of Pigs comes along with Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a book out there I'm going to tell you about called The Road to Disaster, which talks about how Kennedy and both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs affected his decision-making as it applies to Vietnam. It's very interesting. But he got so where he didn't really trust the military advice on many things. Johnson, of course, we got the Tonkin Gulf incident in 1964. This was just after I finished my ROTC summer camp. I'm driving home, and this came over the radio, so I knew where I was going to be going. So Johnson had to get sucked into this thing, and we can blame Johnson and McNamara. Well, you can blame McNamara for sure. Johnson didn't want this war. He really got suckered in. He kept getting told, all we need is a few more troops, we can solve it. Oh, give me a few more troops, we can solve it. Give me a few more troops, we can solve it. 58,000 lives later. And one of the worst things was Nixon. When the peace accords when the peace talks were going on, Nixon through some back channels. Now, Nixon, by the way, was just a candidate now. He's not in office. Through some back channels, got the word to the South Vietnamese negotiators. Don't settle the war. You'll get a better deal after I'm elected. So he threw a monkey wrench into the peace talks. Another 20,000 or so died after that. Okay, and whether you want to admit it or not, the same thing is going on today. There's the same thing is going on today with our government. So in November, my wife's dad passed away September of 2 years ago. But she said, you've never been to see the wall. So she said, I'm going to send you to see the wall. That's cool. Great. So last November, I go down there to see the Vietnam Wall. How many of you have seen the wall, been to the actual wall? Good for you. Great. It's a very solemn experience. The cool thing about doing it in November is I was there alone for much of the time. I was there about an hour and a half alone. And I looked up the names of some of my fellow troopers that are on the wall. And I felt sadness, of course, but I felt anger. I looked at those names and why did this happen? We had no business being there. It was not in our country's best interest. So I was mad. So there's a couple arrows there. After I wrote this, I read something else. There is a division of, it's not part of the CIA, it's a separate intelligence organization, a much smaller organization where the people involved in it are usually at that desk. By desk, I mean looking at a country's intelligence for 10, 14, 15 years at a time, not like the CIA where they get transferred. In 1961, this group told McNamara and Johnson that, going into Vietnam is not a good idea because the peasants, the population, is very much in favor of the communists. They do not trust the Saigon government. It made McNamara furious to do this. That was in 61. Okay. In December of 65, and right here. Now, those of you that have been there, you know that the wall starts here and goes that way, and then it starts on this way up this end and goes this way. So the last person to die is on this wall, the first person is on this wall. They meet, okay. In December of 65, and it was December 17th, 1965, and I know that because it's the day before I got married. McNamara went to Johnson and says, I don't think we can win this. Watching what is happening, I don't think this is good. Well, Johnson got really upset with that, overrode it, and of course, kept that. That was 65. November of 67, while I am on the boat to Vietnam, Johnson went to Johnson and said, McNamara went and said, we cannot win this war. We need to get out now. This is not winnable. That was 1967. So, my friends, everybody from here on, and this entire wall died after McNamara said, we got to get out. If that doesn't piss you off, I don't know what will. It's what, those of you that have been there know this. It's one thing to know that 58,000 people died. It's another to stand there and look at this wall and see those names. And those people are looking at the last panel. Whatever name they're looking at died in the last couple of months of the war. So here's a couple of books that are worth reading. There are a lot of books out there about Vietnam. A lot about the battles and some really cool books and funny books and stuff about battles and accomplishments. But to really understand our involvement in that war, you really should start with this. This is Street Without Joy, written by Bernard Fall, about the fall of the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. A book called Fire in the Lake. This was written in the early 70s by a correspondent who goes back over how we got involved, and it really talks about how the Americans went in there. This should not surprise any of us. We went in there thinking, well, how can these little brown people with bows and arrows defeat us? A great deal of racism involved in that at the time. But we got involved anyway. And as she points out, when we finally left, their economy was in a shambles. It was entirely a service economy based on government employees, bar owners, restaurant owners, and prostitutes. That's what we left them with. A Bright Shining Lie, an excellent book about how we got involved in this, the politics of it. The Best and the Brightest, Dereliction of Duty by General McMaster, who was an advisor to President Trump until Trump fired him because his briefings were too detailed. And this is the Road to Disaster. You should read this book, Road to Disaster. And it talks about the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, how we got involved, how how Johnson just kept getting dragged in by McNamara, and then McNamara towards the end, it destroyed him. He would go back to his office and tear and cry at what was happening, at what he had promoted. So that's the end of the tour there. Real quickly, that was my last office, Boeing 777. God, I love that airplane. This is at the ramp in Frankfurt there. So that's the cockpit of my first airplane and my last airplane. 44 years. Questions, comments, personal insults, I don't care. What do you got?
What happened with your 3-year?
Oh, I didn't sign, and that was the last of it.
You just did 3 then?
I just did 3. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't going back, man. I'll tell you. No. Anything else? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Nixon, kind of skipped over Eisenhower, and it's interesting that, real quickly here, I was trying to figure out the politics of the war before I was